The snow fell quietly over the barbed wire, softening a world built on cruelty. Inside the camp, hundreds of prisoners shivered in silence, their breath turning to frost against the night air. It was Christmas Eve, though no one dared to call it that anymore. The war had stolen too much, even the right to hope. Across the fence, American guards stood watch, their rifles glinting beneath a pale moon. Orders were clear: no contact, no emotion. And yet, something in the air felt different. One guard looked toward the barracks and saw faces, tired, hollow, human. He reached into his pack and pulled out a loaf of bread. Another followed, carrying coffee. Soon, the silence broke, not with gunfire, but with laughter. That night, the enemy wasn't German or American. It was hunger. And for a few sacred hours, humanity won. World War II was a time when mercy seemed impossible. Across continents, soldiers and civilians alike were consumed by a war that left little room for compassion. Yet, amid the chaos and cruelty, moments of humanity still managed to flicker, small, fragile lights that refused to die out. One such moment took place behind the fences of an American prisoner of war camp, far from the front lines, but close to the hearts of those who lived it. The prisoners were German soldiers, men who had once marched proudly under Hitler's banner but were now shadows of themselves, stripped of rank, weapons, and dignity. The American guards, hardened by loss and duty, were taught to see them as the enemy. But as December 25th approached, something inside those guards began to shift. It wasn't orders or politics, it was something simpler, something deeply human, the memory of home. The sound of carols, the warmth of fire, the thought of family gathered around a table. And on that cold winter's night, in a camp surrounded by barbed wire and fear, an extraordinary decision was made, to give the enemy a taste of Christmas. For the prisoners, time inside the camp no longer followed the calendar of the world beyond the fences. Days bled into nights, and weeks passed unnoticed beneath the gray sky. The snow came early that winter, heavy and merciless, blanketing the ground with a silence that felt eternal. Many of the men had been captured months ago in North Africa, others in the fields of France. They had marched through mud, hunger, and humiliation before ending up here, in a remote corner of America they could barely pronounce. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies. The men slept in rows, their cots separated by inches, their dreams haunted by the lives they once had. Some clutched photographs of wives and children, others whispered prayers in German, hoping that someone, anyone, was listening. Letters from home came rarely, and when they did, they were read over and over until the paper wore thin. The Americans, to their credit, treated the prisoners with a certain restraint. The Geneva Convention was more than a rule, it was a reflection of who they wanted to be. But even restraint could not disguise the quiet hostility that hung between captor and captive. Both sides had lost too much to trust easily. For every American who saw a man behind the uniform, there was another who saw only the face of a fallen friend. Yet as the days shortened and the frost crept deeper into the wood of the barracks, something began to change. The guards noticed that the prisoners no longer sang their marching songs at night. The laughter that once echoed faintly from the bunks was gone. Hunger had taken the music out of them. The guards were cold too, of course. The winter spared no one. But they had better boots, warmer coats, and letters that came from wives who still baked pies and children who still believed their fathers were heroes. For the Germans behind the wire, the idea of Christmas was a memory wrapped in pain, the smell of roasted goose, the ringing of church bells, the sound of home that now felt unreachable. One night, as Sergeant Miller made his rounds, he stopped beside the fence and watched the prisoners through the glare of the searchlights. He could see their silhouettes, motionless, defeated, men who once might have been carpenters, teachers, or fathers. He thought of his own brother, missing somewhere in the Pacific, and for the first time, he wondered how his brother might be treated if captured. The thought stayed with him as he returned to the guard hut, rubbing his hands for warmth. The men were drinking weak coffee, playing cards, and trying to forget the cold. Someone mentioned that Christmas was only a few days away. A few laughed bitterly. What good was Christmas in a place like this? But Miller couldn't shake the image of those prisoners huddled in the dark, staring at the same stars he saw when he was a boy in Ohio. It started with a simple question: what if we did something for them? The room went silent. Someone dropped a card onto the table. For them, another guard scoffed. They're Nazis, Miller. You forget that? But Miller didn't answer. He just stared into his cup, lost in thought. The war had already taken too much from both sides. Maybe this one small act could give something back. In the days that followed, word spread quietly among the guards. Some thought it foolish, even dangerous. Others, especially those who missed home the most, couldn't help but agree. They began to gather small things, a few cans of fruit, some sugar, flour, and even a bit of chocolate from care packages. It wasn't much. But it was enough to remind them that compassion hadn't frozen entirely in that winter air. And though no one said it aloud, they all knew the same truth: if they couldn't bring peace to the world, maybe they could bring it, for one night, to this camp behind barbed wire. The morning before Christmas Eve arrived quietly. A gray mist hung over the camp, muffling every sound except for the crunch of boots in the snow. The guards moved slower than usual, not from fatigue, but from the weight of what they were about to do. Each man had agreed, not by command, but by conscience. Orders were strict: maintain distance, maintain discipline. Yet that morning, the men of Company B found themselves breaking the silence of war with an act of rebellion not made of bullets, but of kindness. Sergeant Miller was the first to step forward. He entered the mess hall and looked around at the supplies, the same rations they'd seen every day for months: canned beans, powdered eggs, stale bread. Nothing special. Nothing festive. But Miller had a plan. He turned to Corporal Harris and said, "If we combine our rations, maybe we can make something that feels like Christmas." Harris frowned, skeptical. "You mean, for them?" Miller nodded. "For all of us." And so it began. They started small, melting snow for water, collecting what little coffee grounds they could find, slicing bread thin to make it last. Then came the surprises. Private Thompson produced a can of peaches he'd been saving since summer. Another guard, Jenkins, found a tin of cocoa powder in a package from home. Someone else offered sugar cubes sent by his wife, wrapped in a letter that now smelled faintly of perfume. They laughed at the absurdity of it: American soldiers preparing Christmas dinner for the enemy. But beneath the laughter was something deeper: relief. For the first time in months, they felt human again. Meanwhile, word of strange activity spread among the prisoners. Through cracks in the barracks wall, they watched the guards carrying sacks and boxes toward the kitchen. Whispers stirred among them: what are they doing? Some thought it was a drill. Others feared punishment. But a few dared to hope. Inside the kitchen, the guards worked quietly, careful not to draw attention from officers who might put an end to their plan. They mixed ingredients with the clumsy tenderness of men who hadn't cooked in years. Someone joked, "My wife would kill me if she saw what I'm doing to this dough." Another replied, "She'd probably be proud." By afternoon, the mess hall smelled different, not of routine, but of life. The air filled with the aroma of baked bread, roasted potatoes, and sweet fruit warmed on the stove. The men paused, looking at one another, realizing that for the first time since they'd arrived, the camp smelled like home. As the sun sank low, the preparations took on a rhythm. Some guards decorated the tables with whatever they could find: pine branches from the edge of the camp, torn bits of cloth as makeshift ribbons. One soldier carved a small wooden star from a crate and nailed it above the doorway. It wasn't much, but to them, it was a reminder of a world that still had beauty in it. That evening, Miller met with the camp commander, Captain Reynolds, a man known for his strict adherence to military order. The guard stood outside as Miller entered, heart pounding. "Sir," he began, "we'd like permission to share a Christmas meal with the prisoners tomorrow." Reynolds didn't look up from his papers. "You want to what?" "A simple meal, sir. Nothing formal. Just food. A chance to show them, we're still men." The captain stared at him for a long moment. The air felt heavy. Finally, he sighed. "This war has taken enough. I won't stop you. But keep it quiet. The brass won't understand." Miller saluted sharply. "Thank you, sir." The next morning, frost glistened like glass across the camp. The guards moved quickly, setting up long tables near the fence. They laid out whatever they had managed to gather: bread, potatoes, bits of fruit, and even a pot of stew made from rationed scraps. One man found a small harmonica in his pack and began to play softly. The tune was uneven, but unmistakable: Silent Night. Across the barbed wire, the prisoners stood watching in disbelief. A few thought it was a cruel trick. Others pressed their hands against the frozen wire, their breath visible in the morning cold. Then, as if breaking some unspoken barrier, one American guard walked forward and placed a loaf of bread on the ground between them. He stepped back and waited. A German soldier, hesitant, approached from the other side. He looked around nervously, then picked up the bread. The two men locked eyes. No salute, no words, just understanding. The guards gestured toward the tables, inviting the prisoners closer. Slowly, cautiously, the gates were opened. No weapons were drawn. No orders were shouted. Just men, enemies by command, brothers by circumstance, walking toward each other through the snow. For a brief, miraculous moment, the war stopped existing. The evening of December 24th descended with a calm that felt almost supernatural. The wind that had howled for days suddenly stilled, and a soft snow began to fall, quiet, steady, endless. The guards and prisoners stood together beneath the same gray sky, unsure of what to do next. The rules of war had no chapter for moments like this. For the first time since the conflict began, there was no command, no enemy, only men staring at one another across the fragile line that divided captivity from freedom. Sergeant Miller raised his hand, motioning for everyone to gather. "We don't have much," he said softly, his breath fogging the air, "but tonight, we share what we've got." He gestured toward the tables where the simple meal waited: bread, potatoes, steaming coffee, and a few precious tins of fruit. The aroma carried through the camp, mixing with the scent of pine and cold metal. For the German prisoners, it was the smell of memory, of homes left behind, of mothers, of wives, of children who might still be waiting. At first, the Germans hesitated. Years of propaganda and fear held them back. But then one young prisoner, barely 20, stepped forward. He removed his cap, nodded politely to Miller, and whispered, "Danke." The word, small and trembling, seemed to melt the ice between them. Others followed, their faces cautious but softened. Soon the tables were surrounded, Americans on one side, Germans on the other, sharing space that only hours ago had been forbidden. Private Thompson, who had smuggled the peaches from his rations, opened the tin with a grin. "Guess it's not much of a feast," he said, handing it to a German soldier. The man accepted it with trembling hands, as if it were gold. "It's perfect," he whispered, his voice breaking. Then someone began to hum a tune. It was faint at first, just a few notes carried on the cold air: Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The Germans recognized it instantly: Silent Night. Within seconds, others joined in, their voices blending in fragile harmony. Across the table, the Americans picked up the English words. Two languages, one melody. The camp fell into a hush so deep that even the guards at the watchtowers stopped moving. The snowflakes drifted like feathers through the lamplight as voices rose together, soldiers who had once aimed rifles at each other now singing the same prayer for peace. When the song ended, no one spoke. Some smiled weakly, others wiped tears before they froze. Then, quietly, one of the guards poured coffee into tin cups and began passing them down the table. A German officer, older, weary, but dignified, raised his cup and said, "To those who remember what it means to be human." Miller raised his own in return. "And to those who remind us." They drank. They laughed. They told stories in broken sentences, gestures filling the gaps where words could not. One prisoner drew pictures in the snow, his village, his wife, his 2 children. The Americans leaned closer, nodding, understanding more through emotion than translation. Hours passed, and the camp that had once echoed with orders and the rattle of boots now pulsed with warmth. The guards handed out what gifts they could, cigarettes, candy, and even an old deck of cards. In return, the prisoners offered small tokens they had hidden for months, carved trinkets, a piece of cloth embroidered with initials, a hand-drawn Christmas star made from the foil of a ration pack. Near midnight, Captain Reynolds quietly approached from the shadows. He had watched everything from a distance, uncertain whether to allow it. But when he saw the faces, American and German alike, lit by lanterns and peace, he simply stood there and listened. For a man who had seen too much death, this was a vision of redemption. Then came the most unexpected sound of all, laughter. Real, unguarded laughter. It rose from the tables and echoed off the wooden barracks. The same walls that had witnessed suffering now carried the sound of joy. Even the snow seemed to glitter brighter, as though heaven itself had paused to listen. At one point, a young German soldier, perhaps emboldened by the coffee or the warmth, reached into his coat and pulled out a small harmonica. He began to play a soft melody, one that blended sorrow and hope in equal measure. The guards watched in silence until Private Jenkins, the man with the harmonica earlier, took out his own and joined in. 2 enemies, 2 harmonicas, 1 song, a duet between sides that hours ago wouldn't have dared look each other in the eye. When the final notes faded into the night, Miller looked around the table. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," he said quietly, "but tonight, the war stops here." The Germans nodded, some smiling through tears. And for that one sacred night, the fences no longer mattered. The searchlights dimmed, the guards lowered their rifles, and the snow kept falling, erasing the footprints of war. Men who had been enemies became something far greater. They became proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, kindness could still defy command. As dawn approached, the prisoners were escorted back to their barracks. No one spoke of orders or consequences. They simply exchanged a few final handshakes through the wire, their fingers brushing briefly before pulling away. That night would never appear in military reports. No medals were given. No commanders praised it. But for those who lived it, it was the only victory that truly mattered. The morning after Christmas came quietly. The snow that had fallen through the night now shimmered like glass beneath the pale winter sun. The camp, once a fortress of suspicion and orders, stood silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath, afraid to disturb what had happened. The guards moved through their routines as usual, but something had changed in their eyes. The stiffness in their salutes, the guarded tones in their voices, all of it seemed softened by the memory of the night before. In the barracks, the prisoners awoke to the faint smell of bread and coffee still lingering in the air. They spoke in hushed voices, afraid the magic might vanish if they said too much. Some of them clutched small tokens from the night, a cigarette stub, a torn piece of cloth, a piece of bread saved from the table. They were worthless by any measure of war, but priceless in meaning. They were proof that even behind wire and under guard, they had been seen as men, not enemies, not numbers, but men. Later that day, a German officer, the same man who had toasted to humanity, approached the fence. He waited until Sergeant Miller came into view, then raised his hand in a respectful salute. Miller returned it without hesitation. No words were exchanged, but none were needed. They had spoken a language older than war, one that didn't need translation, respect. Over the next few days, the camp returned to its normal rhythm. Orders resumed, watchtowers were manned, and the boundaries of war settled back into place. But beneath the surface, something enduring had taken root. When guards passed by the prisoners, they nodded slightly, a gesture unnoticed by most but deeply felt by those who understood. The prisoners, in turn, worked with a quiet diligence, sometimes leaving small tokens, a carved figure, a folded paper star, where the guards might find them. As the war dragged on and the world continued to drown in blood and smoke, the memory of that Christmas faded into the quiet corners of history. Battles would rage across Europe and the Pacific, nations would rise and fall, and the men who had shared that meal would be scattered to different fates. Some would return home to families who never knew what kindness they had shown behind enemy lines. Others would never see home again. But for those who survived, that night never truly ended. Long after the war, in living rooms and hospitals, in letters to sons and grandchildren, they would speak softly of the Christmas behind the wire. They would describe not victory or defeat, but the moment they remembered how to feel human, how to see the man across the fence not as a monster, but as a mirror. In museums and archives, the event barely exists, a few faded photographs, a handful of testimonies buried in forgotten journals. Yet its legacy is larger than any battle. It is a reminder that even in humanity's darkest age, light can still appear, not from the heavens, but from the hearts of ordinary men. When guns fall silent, and the world counts its scars, this is what remains, that in the midst of war's madness, mercy still found a way to speak. And it spoke through bread, song, and snow, on the forgotten Christmas of 1944.